Most people believe they are thinking freely. They believe their thoughts are chosen, directed, and under control. But if you observe closely, something different begins to appear. Thoughts do not arrive when you choose them. They appear on their own. They present ideas, conclusions, and judgments without being invited. And more importantly, they often arrive with a sense of certainty. This certainty is what gives thoughts their power. A thought does not introduce itself as a possibility. It presents itself as a conclusion. This will not work. This is too difficult. You are not ready. These thoughts feel immediate and convincing. And because they feel convincing, they are rarely questioned. They are followed. This is where the illusion begins. Because when a thought feels true, it is often accepted as true. But feeling true and being true are not the same thing. A thought can feel certain simply because it has been repeated. The mind learns through repetition. And anything repeated often enough begins to feel familiar. And what is familiar feels safe, and what feels safe is rarely challenged. This is how thoughts gain authority, not through accuracy, but through repetition. Over time, these repeated thoughts begin to shape perception. They influence how situations are interpreted. They influence how decisions are made. They influence what actions are taken. And eventually, they begin to define identity. A person who repeatedly experiences thoughts of limitation begins to see themselves as limited. A person who repeatedly experiences thoughts of doubt begins to see themselves as uncertain. Not because these things are inherently true, but because they have been repeated enough to feel true. This is the illusion of mental control, the belief that you are directing your thoughts, when in reality, many of your thoughts are directing you. And because this process happens quietly, it often goes unnoticed. There is no clear moment where a person decides to believe something limiting. It happens gradually, through repetition, through familiarity, through automatic acceptance. This is why two people can experience the same situation and interpret it completely differently. One sees opportunity, the other sees risk. One moves forward, the other hesitates. The difference is not the situation, it is the pattern of thought that has been repeated over time. And those patterns feel like truth. But they are not fixed, they are learned. And anything learned can be changed. But before it can be changed, it must be recognized. You must begin to see that not every thought that appears deserves to be followed. Not every thought that feels true is accurate, and not every conclusion presented by the mind should be accepted without question. This realization creates the first shift, because once you begin to question your thoughts, you begin to separate from them. And once that separation exists, control becomes possible. Once you begin to notice this pattern, something changes in how you experience your own mind. You begin to see thoughts as events rather than truths. They appear. They pass. And in between those moments, there is an opportunity to observe. This observation is subtle, but it is powerful. Because when you observe a thought, you create distance from it. And distance reduces its influence. A thought that once felt immediate now feels optional. A conclusion that once felt absolute now feels questionable. This shift does not eliminate thoughts. It changes your relationship to them. Instead of automatically following them, you begin to evaluate them. You begin to ask where they came from. Was this thought formed through direct experience? Or was it formed through repetition? Was it chosen intentionally or absorbed over time? These questions interrupt the automatic process, and when the process is interrupted, control begins to emerge. Because control is not about preventing thoughts, it is about choosing responses. At first, this can feel uncomfortable, because the mind is accustomed to moving quickly. It presents thoughts and expects immediate agreement. When that agreement is delayed, there is tension. A sense of uncertainty, a pull to return to what feels familiar. This is why many people return to automatic thinking, not because it is correct, but because it is comfortable. But if you remain in that space of observation, something begins to stabilize. You become less reactive, less influenced by every passing thought, more grounded in your ability to choose. This creates a new pattern, one where thoughts are no longer commands, they are suggestions. And not all suggestions need to be accepted. This realization begins to weaken the illusion, because the illusion depends on automatic agreement. It depends on the absence of awareness. And once awareness is present, the illusion cannot operate in the same way. You begin to see the structure of your thinking. You recognize recurring patterns. You notice which thoughts appear most often. And you begin to understand how those thoughts have shaped your behavior over time. This understanding leads to a deeper realization. You are not required to follow every thought that appears. You are not required to believe every conclusion presented by your mind. And once this becomes clear, something shifts. You begin to take ownership of your direction, not by controlling thoughts, but by choosing which ones to follow. As awareness becomes more consistent, a deeper pattern begins to reveal itself. You start to recognize that many of your thoughts are not isolated events. They are connected. They follow familiar paths. They return in similar forms, even in different situations. This is because the mind operates through patterns. It learns what to expect, and then it begins to repeat those expectations. If you have repeatedly expected difficulty, the mind begins to anticipate it. If you have repeatedly expected failure, the mind begins to prepare for it. And these expectations do not feel like guesses. They feel like insight. They feel like truth. But what you are experiencing is not insight. It is reinforcement. The mind is repeating what it has learned to expect, and because it has been repeated, it feels reliable. This is how the illusion strengthens. A thought appears, supported by past repetition. It feels familiar, it feels accurate, and without question, it is followed. But when you begin to observe this process, something becomes clear. The thought is not responding to the present moment. It is responding to the past. It is applying old patterns to current situations, and in doing so, it limits what is possible. Because instead of seeing what is actually in front of you, you are seeing what you have seen before. This is where awareness becomes essential. Because awareness brings you back to the present. It allows you to see the difference between what is happening now and what has happened before. And when you see that difference, the thought loses some of its authority. It no longer feels absolute. It becomes questionable. You begin to ask whether the pattern applies, whether the expectation is accurate, whether the conclusion is valid. And in asking these questions, you begin to interrupt the cycle. The mind is no longer allowed to repeat without examination. It is required to justify itself. And often, when examined, the thought does not hold up. It reveals itself as an assumption, a habit, a repeated conclusion that was never fully tested. This realization creates a new level of clarity. Because you begin to see that many of the limits you experience are not imposed by reality. They are imposed by repetition, by patterns that have been followed without question. And once you see those patterns, you are no longer confined by them in the same way. You begin to explore beyond them. You begin to respond differently. You begin to act in ways that do not align with the old pattern. And in doing so, you create new experiences. Experiences that contradict the old expectation. Experiences that begin to weaken the pattern. This is how change happens, not by forcing the mind to stop thinking, but by changing the pattern of what is followed. And over time, these new patterns begin to replace the old ones. The expectations shift, the responses change, and the illusion begins to dissolve. Because what once felt certain is now seen as flexible, and what once felt fixed is now understood as learned. This understanding creates freedom, not from thought itself, but from the automatic belief in it. As these patterns begin to shift, something else becomes noticeable. Your response time changes. There is a pause that was not there before, a moment between the thought appearing and the action that follows. This moment may be brief, but it is significant, because within that moment there is a decision. Before, that decision was automatic. Now, it is becoming deliberate. You are no longer reacting in the same way. You are choosing. This is where real control begins to take form, not in the elimination of thoughts, but in the space that allows you to respond differently to them. At first, this space requires effort. You have to remind yourself to pause, to observe, to question, because the mind is still operating from old patterns. It still expects immediate agreement. It still presents thoughts with certainty. But each time you pause instead of react, you strengthen that space. and over time, it becomes more natural. You no longer have to force the pause. It begins to happen on its own. This is when the mind starts to reorganize, because the patterns that once dominated are no longer being reinforced. They are being interrupted, and anything that is interrupted repeatedly begins to weaken. At the same time, new patterns are being formed. Patterns of observation, patterns of questioning, patterns of deliberate action. These patterns begin to take precedence, not because they are stronger at first, but because they are chosen. And what is chosen consistently becomes dominant. This shift is subtle, but it is powerful, because it changes how you experience your own thinking. You begin to feel less controlled by it, less pulled in different directions, more stable, more grounded, more aware of what is happening internally. And this awareness creates confidence, not the kind that depends on outcomes, but the kind that comes from understanding your own process. You know how your mind operates. You recognize its patterns, and because you recognize them, you are no longer surprised by them. You are prepared. You are able to respond instead of react. And this changes how you move through situations. Challenges no longer feel overwhelming in the same way, because you are not immediately accepting every thought that appears. You are evaluating, you are deciding, and in doing so, you are guiding your own experience. This is where the illusion begins to break down completely, because the illusion depends on automatic belief, and once belief becomes optional, the illusion cannot hold. What remains is clarity, and with that clarity comes direction, a direction that is no longer determined by habit, but by choice. As this clarity becomes more consistent, you begin to notice changes that extend beyond individual thoughts. Your behavior starts to shift, not because you are forcing yourself to act differently, but because the thoughts guiding your actions have changed. You begin to take steps you would have previously avoided. You begin to follow through where you once hesitated. You begin to move forward even when uncertainty is present. This does not mean doubt disappears. It means it no longer controls your direction. This is an important distinction, because many people believe they must eliminate doubt before they can act. But that is not how the mind works. Doubt is a natural part of thinking. It appears as a possibility, a question, a potential risk, but it only becomes limiting when it is obeyed without question, when it is accepted as a final conclusion. Once you understand this, your relationship with doubt changes. You no longer see it as something that must be avoided. You see it as something that can be evaluated, considered, and then either followed or dismissed. This removes its authority. It becomes just another thought, and like all thoughts, it is subject to choice. This shift opens new possibilities, because you are no longer waiting for certainty. You are acting based on direction. You are moving based on intention. And as you do this repeatedly, momentum begins to build. Each action reinforces the next. Each decision strengthens your confidence. Each experience provides new evidence, evidence that contradicts old patterns, evidence that expands what you believe is possible. And as this evidence accumulates, your perception changes. You begin to see yourself differently, not as someone controlled by thought, but as someone capable of directing it. This identity shift is gradual, but it is powerful, because once you begin to see yourself as someone who can choose, that belief begins to influence everything else. Your actions align with it. Your decisions reflect it. Your responses support it. And over time, it becomes your new baseline, a way of operating that no longer depends on automatic thinking, but on deliberate direction. This is the result of consistently questioning what once felt unquestionable, of interrupting what once felt automatic, of choosing what once felt predetermined. And in doing so, you begin to build something new, not by changing the world around you, but by changing the way you engage with it, through awareness, through choice, through repeated action aligned with intention. If you take anything from this, let it be this: not every thought that feels true deserves to be followed, and not every conclusion presented by your mind is final. There is always a moment, a space between what appears and what you choose to do with it. That space may feel small, but it holds everything, because within that space you decide. You decide whether to repeat an old pattern or begin creating a new one. You decide whether to accept limitation or question it. You decide whether to hesitate or move forward. These decisions may seem minor, but they are not. They are the building blocks of direction, and direction determines outcome. Over time, the thoughts you choose to follow become the life you experience. Not all at once, but gradually, through repetition, through consistency, through the quiet accumulation of small choices. So the question is not whether your thoughts will appear. They will. The question is whether you will follow them without question, or begin to examine them with awareness. Because once you begin to examine them, you begin to see them differently. And once you see them differently, you begin to respond differently. And that difference changes everything. Not instantly, but steadily, and in a way that continues to build over time. Because the mind you follow determines the direction you move. And once you begin to choose that direction consciously, you are no longer operating under illusion. You are operating with intention, and that is where real change begins. There is another layer to this that becomes clear over time. The more you observe your thoughts, the more you begin to notice that many of them are not original. They are repetitions, echoes of past experiences, fragments of things you have heard, seen, or absorbed without fully examining. And because they are repeated, they begin to feel like your own voice. But in many cases, they are not. They are inherited patterns, collected over time and reinforced through repetition. This realization can be uncomfortable at first, because it challenges the idea that every thought you have is truly yours, but it also creates an opportunity. Because if many of your limiting thoughts were learned, they can also be unlearned. They can be replaced. They can be reshaped. But only if they are recognized, only if they are brought into awareness. This is why observation is so important. Not to judge your thoughts, not to eliminate them, but to understand them, to see where they came from, to see how often they repeat, to see how they influence your behavior. Because once you understand a pattern, you are no longer completely controlled by it. You begin to see it as something separate from yourself. And once that separation exists, you gain the ability to respond differently. You are no longer reacting automatically. You are choosing. And this choice changes everything. Because instead of reinforcing the same pattern again and again, you begin to interrupt it. You begin to replace it. You begin to build something new. At first, this change may feel small, almost insignificant. A single moment of awareness, a single decision not to follow a thought. But these moments accumulate. They build. They create momentum. And over time, that momentum begins to shift your entire experience. You think differently. You respond differently. You act differently. And because of that, you begin to experience different outcomes. Not because the world has changed, but because your internal process has changed. You are no longer operating from unconscious repetition. You are operating from awareness, and awareness creates possibility. It allows you to step outside of what has been repeated and begin exploring what has not yet been experienced. This is where growth truly begins, not when circumstances change, but when your relationship with your own mind changes, because the mind you follow determines what you see, what you believe, and what you act upon. And once you begin to question that process, you begin to take control of it. Not perfectly, not instantly, but consistently. And consistency is what creates lasting change. So as you move forward, remember this. You are not required to accept every thought that appears. You are not required to follow every conclusion your mind presents. You are allowed to pause, to question, to choose. And in that choice, you begin to shape your direction. One decision at a time, one thought at a time, until the pattern itself begins to change. And when the pattern changes, everything that follows begins to change with it.